Somewhere in the Persian Gulf right now, an oil tanker is sitting still. Its captain won't move it, the insurance company won't cover it. And because of that one ship, and thousands more like it, the price of oil, gas, groceries, and airline tickets just went up for almost every person on Earth. That's not a metaphor. That's what's happening right now in March 2026, as the United States and Israel are actively engaged in military operations against Iran. And while most people are watching the war footage and the press conferences, the real story, the one that will affect your life for years, is happening in the numbers. Oil futures, shipping rates, inflation data, and decisions being made in central banks from Washington to Beijing. In this video, we're going to break all of it down. What this conflict actually is, why Iran's geography gives it enormous economic leverage, how the war is already disrupting global energy markets, who gets hurt the most, and what the possible futures look like for the world economy. By the end, you'll understand not just why this war is happening, but why it's already in your wallet. Chapter 1. What the 2026 Iran war actually is. Because this conflict didn't come out of nowhere. Iran and Israel have been locked in what experts call a shadow war for decades. Proxy militias, cyber attacks, assassinations, and covert operations, all designed to weaken each other without triggering open war. That shadow war escalated sharply through 2024 and 2025, with direct missile and drone exchanges between the two countries, Iran's nuclear program advancing, and US-Iran nuclear talks collapsing. Then, in late February 2026, the situation broke wide open. US and Israeli forces launched strikes on Iranian military and nuclear sites, marking the start of what is now being called an open military conflict. Israel's stated goal, according to multiple reports, has shifted towards something far more ambitious than just destroying nuclear sites: regime change in Tehran. Iran, for its part, has warned that US military bases in the region could be targeted, has struck at least one oil tanker near the Strait of Hormuz, and its foreign minister stated publicly this week that Iran is confident it could counter a US ground invasion. This is no longer a shadow war. It's an open one, and the economic consequences are already unfolding. Chapter 2. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most dangerous choke point. To understand why this war shakes the entire global economy, you need to understand one narrow strip of water. The Strait of Hormuz is a passage between Iran and Oman, at its narrowest only about 33 kilometers wide, and it is arguably the single most important piece of ocean on Earth. Around a quarter of all seaborne oil trade, and roughly a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, passes through this strait every single day. We're talking about approximately 17 to 21 million barrels of oil per day, flowing through a channel you could almost swim across. The countries that depend on this flow are not small players. China, India, Japan, and South Korea, 4 of the world's largest economies, are heavily reliant on Hormuz oil and gas imports. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, even partially, even temporarily, it doesn't just raise energy prices. It puts the entire global supply chain under pressure simultaneously. And Iran knows this. For years, Iranian military doctrine has included the explicit threat to close the Strait of Hormuz as a last resort weapon. In a war, that threat just became much more real. Chapter 3. Oil tankers, insurance, and the shipping crisis. You don't have to close the Strait of Hormuz to wreck global shipping. You just have to make it too dangerous to sail through. Since strikes began in late February 2026, Strait of Hormuz tanker traffic has slowed dramatically. Insurance companies, who cover ships against war risk, have either withdrawn coverage entirely or raised war risk premiums to eye-watering levels. When a ship loses war risk insurance, it can't dock at most ports. Banks won't finance the cargo. The ship effectively becomes stranded. Prices to charter large oil supertankers have soared. Shipping companies are demanding enormous premiums to route vessels through the region, costs that get passed directly to whoever buys the oil at the other end. According to CNBC, oil supertanker day rates have spiked significantly since hostilities began, and several major shipping operators have suspended Hormuz transits entirely. This is what economists call a supply shock. Not just less oil, but more expensive oil to move. And that price surge travels through every economy that imports energy. Chapter 4: Oil prices, gas prices, and the inflation comeback. Now let's follow the money into your life. Before the conflict escalated in late February 2026, oil prices had been relatively stable. Within days of US and Israeli strikes on Iran, crude oil surged and stock futures sank simultaneously. Bloomberg is reporting that the Iran war oil shock threatens to unleash a new wave of global inflation, coming at exactly the wrong moment for central banks that spent years fighting the last inflation surge. Here's the chain reaction. Oil prices rise leads to gasoline and diesel prices rise, leads to transport costs for every product rise. Food prices rise, utility bills rise. Consumers have less money to spend on everything else. And here's the cruel irony. Central banks like the US Federal Reserve were just starting to ease interest rates after years of hikes to fight post-pandemic inflation. An oil shock now forces them to choose between two bad options. Option 1, keep rates high to fight the new inflation, but risk pushing the economy into recession. Option 2, cut rates anyway to protect growth, but let inflation run hot again. According to Reuters, an IMF official has stated that the economic impact of the Middle East war will depend heavily on its duration, the scale of damage to energy infrastructure, and how high energy costs ultimately climb. In short, the longer this war goes, the more expensive your life gets. Chapter 5: Who gets hit hardest? The Asian energy trap. While everyone feels the pain, some countries feel it far more than others. The economies most exposed to a Hormuz disruption are in Asia. China, India, Japan, and South Korea together import hundreds of millions of barrels of oil through the Strait of Hormuz every year. For Japan and South Korea, there is almost no alternative. They have minimal domestic oil production and limited pipeline access to other sources. If Hormuz closes, they face a genuine energy crisis. Not just higher prices, but potential shortages. China, the world's largest crude oil importer, is in a more complex position. It has been buying heavily discounted Iranian oil via shadow fleets, but that supply is now directly at risk from the conflict. India, similarly, had been one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil under sanction bypassing arrangements. A conflict that cuts off Iranian exports puts India under significant pressure to find more expensive alternatives quickly. For European countries, the exposure is more indirect, but higher LNG prices from a disrupted Gulf still filter through to energy bills and industrial costs. And for the developing world, countries in Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia that already spend large portions of their GDP on energy imports, a prolonged oil shock could tip fragile economies into genuine crises. Chapter 6: Iran's secret oil, the shadow fleet, and sanctions. Here's something most people don't realize. Iran has been selling oil anyway, despite years of heavy sanctions. Using a network of aging tankers that turn off their tracking signals, change their names, and transfer cargo at sea, Iran has been exporting an estimated 1.5 to 1.9 million barrels of oil per day, much of it going to China. This shadow fleet operation has been one of the biggest open secrets in global energy markets, and it has given Iran a lifeline that partially offset the economic pain of US sanctions. Now, with open military conflict, that shadow fleet is under direct threat. Any Iranian tanker near the Strait of Hormuz is potentially a military target, or at minimum, too dangerous to operate. If Iranian oil exports collapse, whether from military strikes on oil infrastructure or simply because no one will move the tankers, that removes roughly 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day from global supply in an already tight market. That gap doesn't just disappear. It shows up as higher prices at the pump, higher heating bills, and higher costs embedded in almost every physical product you buy. Meanwhile, the US is pushing for tighter sanctions enforcement, which could further squeeze whatever Iranian oil is still reaching world markets. Chapter 7. Second-order effects: shipping, food, flights, and recession risk. Oil isn't the only thing that moves through the Persian Gulf, and energy isn't the only thing that gets more expensive. Shipping costs for all goods that transit the region are rising. Think electronics components, manufactured goods, agricultural products, anything that moves by container ship through or near the Gulf. Airlines are rerouting flights to avoid Iranian airspace, adding hours to journeys between Europe and Asia and burning significantly more fuel. Costs that show up in ticket prices. Food prices are particularly vulnerable. Modern agriculture runs on diesel for tractors, transport, and fertilizer production. When diesel gets more expensive, food gets more expensive. And then there is the broader confidence effect. When businesses and consumers see a major geopolitical conflict with no clear end in sight, investment slows, hiring slows, and economic activity contracts. Bloomberg and CNBC analysts are warning that a prolonged conflict could put the global economic recovery at risk, with recession odds rising in several major economies if oil stays elevated for months. This is the hidden cost of war that doesn't make the headline ticker. It shows up 6 months later in GDP numbers and unemployment data. Chapter 8. The geopolitical power shift: China, Russia, and the new energy order. A war this significant doesn't just move prices, it moves power. Russia, which has been under Western sanctions since 2022 and has been selling oil at discounts to Asian buyers, benefits from any Middle East disruption that takes Iranian and Gulf oil off the market. Higher prices mean more revenue for Moscow despite the caps. China is watching this conflict with intense focus. It has deep economic interests in Iranian oil, in Gulf stability, and in the broader question of whether US military power can still dominate the Middle East. If the US and Israel succeed in reshaping the Iranian government, it could extend Western influence over one of the world's most critical energy regions. If they get bogged down, it could accelerate the shift toward a multipolar energy order where China and Russia have more leverage. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, US allies but also pragmatic operators, are being watched closely for whether they will increase oil production to stabilize prices or hold back to protect their own revenues. And the dollar itself is in play. Oil is priced in US dollars, so a conflict that raises oil prices also reinforces dollar demand globally. But a war that drags on and damages US credibility could accelerate the slow push by China, Russia, and others to settle energy trades in other currencies. Chapter 9. 3 futures. What happens next? So, where does this go? Let's look at 3 realistic scenarios. Scenario 1. A swift resolution. If military strikes achieve their stated objectives quickly, Iran agrees to negotiations, and the strait remains functional, markets could stabilize relatively fast. Oil prices would likely pull back, shipping would resume, and the inflation shock would be short-lived. History suggests markets bounce back quickly from brief conflicts. Scenario 2. A prolonged war. If Iran retaliates effectively, the conflict drags into months of strikes and counterstrikes, and Hormuz traffic remains seriously disrupted. The economic damage compounds. Oil prices stay elevated, inflation makes a sustained comeback, central banks are trapped, and several emerging market economies face debt crises as their import bills explode. Scenario 3. Hormuz closure. The most extreme case. Iran makes good on its decades-old threat to close the strait, even partially. Oil could spike to levels not seen in modern history. Global shipping enters chaos, and the economic shock would be comparable to, or worse than, the 1973 oil embargo that triggered a decade of stagflation in the West. Right now, no one knows which scenario we're in. The IMF, Bloomberg, and Reuters analysts are all saying the same thing. Duration and escalation are the variables that determine whether this is a temporary shock or a generational economic reset. So here's the bottom line. Wars don't stay in the countries where they're fought. They travel through pipelines and shipping lanes and central bank spreadsheets and grocery store price tags until they reach every corner of the world. The 2026 Iran conflict is happening in a place most people will never visit, but it's sitting inside the global energy system in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. The shadow it casts over the world economy is enormous. So tell me in the comments, do you think this conflict escalates further, or does a deal get done before the real economic damage sets in? And which of the three scenarios do you think we're heading toward? If you want to keep understanding the systems behind the headlines, not just what happened, but why it matters to your life, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next deep dive.